Hello friends, tonight we step into a world where desire is the law, and power is measured by moans. This is not a story about an emperor, but a journey of a man's unraveling when sex becomes a religion, the body, a stage, and the self a role that never leaves the spotlight. If you think pleasure is harmless, stay until the end, because afterward, you'll see some things don't kill you, but they make you no longer human. Before you lean back comfortably, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you truly enjoy the content I share, and leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's fascinating to see people tuning in from all over the world. Now turn off the lights, maybe switch on a fan for some background noise, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. Tonight we begin with something not for the faint of heart. No wars, no armored horses, no ancient magic, just a bed and a Roman emperor with desires that surpass even human boundaries. Forget sweet love stories, pure relationships, or Greek-style romance. We're about to enter a world where sex is politics, the body a tool, and power is asserted through moans, not decrees. You might think you're mentally prepared, but trust me, you're not. Because the guide for this journey is Nero, emperor, self-proclaimed artist, murderer, lover of men, women, and a moaning doll. And the room where it all begins, where all boundaries melt, where all morality is twisted, is his bedroom. But this isn't a room with flickering candles or gentle lyre music. This is a stage where bodies once lay, where whispers become judgments, and where those who enter rarely leave with the same face. So before you sit down, make sure the door is locked, the curtains drawn, and if someone's listening with you, look at them and say, from now on, don't ever call anyone a pervert until you know who Nero is. This isn't textbook history. This is sex wielded like a whip, not to arouse, but to control. And tonight, we won't just peek through the keyhole of the emperor's bedroom. We'll walk right in, barefoot, across cold stone, amidst howls, and dive deep into a place no one should linger too long. Ready? The lights dim. The air grows heavy. Don't ask about the smell. Just know, the door is open, and Nero is waiting. But before we climb into bed with the emperor, there's one thing you need to understand clearly, and it's so crucial that without it, you'd think Nero was an exception, when in reality, he's just the most exaggerated version of a society already warped at its core. In ancient Rome, sex wasn't private. It wasn't hidden behind curtains, preached against in churches, or considered shameful. On the contrary, it was painted on walls, carved onto wine goblets, sung about at festivals, and sometimes bestowed as a reward for loyalty. You didn't make love in Rome, you performed, and the performance wasn't for love, but to assert status. The position of being on top wasn't just physical, it was a political statement. In a society that prized virilitas, masculine dominance, the one who penetrated was the victor, the one penetrated the loser. And that's why Nero, whether sleeping with men, women, slaves, or philosophers, always maintained one supreme rule: never let anyone else take the lead. Sounds simple, wrong, because when sexual dominance becomes a social norm, sex is no longer an experience between two people. It's an arena, a system, a pyramid, where the one at the top needs no permission, while those at the bottom aren't allowed to speak. Imagine a city where public bathhouses have statues of copulation hanging on the walls, where guardian charms are shaped like winged phalluses, where oil lamps are molded into women riding men like war horses, and the Romans called it good fortune, not pornography, but luck. You might ask, was there a limit? Yes, but not morality, status. A senator couldn't be caught as the receiver in an encounter with a slave, as it would cost him his ruling authority. A free man would be despised if he let himself be touched like a woman, not because of homosexuality, but because of losing control. It wasn't about gender, it was about power. And in a world like that, you didn't love with your heart, but with your position. Sex became a physical embodiment of the social order. Who dominated, whom was who ruled whom. And Nero, from a young age, learned that lesson. He knew that when he slept with someone, he wasn't just satisfying himself. He was reconstructing Rome's structure through another's body. So don't be surprised when an emperor forces all banquet guests to wear dresses or makes a burly man play a weeping bride on stage. He wasn't doing it for ordinary pleasure. He was reenacting the empire's roles under the sheets. But here's the irony. While all of Roman society played this game of dominance and submission, no one dared admit they could be on the losing side. Everyone feared being exposed as weak, even in their sleep. So everyone tried to play the top, leading to a bizarre race where everyone strained, everyone performed, and no one truly felt loved. If you were a Roman teenager, the first lesson about sex wasn't who to love, but what position to take. There were even textbooks on how to maintain power while lying down, and that's when you realize Nero wasn't perverse. He was just the one willing to play the role for the whole society, a society that wanted to conquer the world, but feared being conquered by its own desires. And if you think that's warped enough, wait until you meet his mother. Because in ancient Rome, a mother didn't just teach her child to eat, study, or behave. Sometimes, she taught them how to take someone in bed. So in the next part, we'll sit face to face with the most powerful woman in Rome at the time, Agrippina the Younger, a woman who didn't just give birth to Nero, but shaped his desires. Not metaphorically, not through moral teachings or strict doctrines, but through her body, her gaze, and a presence inseparable from his earliest thrills. In a world where sex was power, and power began with blood, a mother was no longer just a mother. She was the first lesson in manipulation, the bedside book on how to own someone without touching them. Agrippina, sister of Caligula, wife of Claudius, and a mother willing to kill anyone standing between her and the throne for her son. But don't be fooled, she didn't do it out of maternal love. She did it knowing that if she created an obedient emperor, she would rule the empire, and her tool to control Nero, not whips, but a gaze, a hand placed just so on his shoulder, a whisper while he changed for a bath, a kiss lingering a bit too long on his forehead. Things not incriminating enough to convict, but enough to blur the line for a 15-year-old boy between being loved and being possessed. A Roman historian described, Agrippina looked at her son like a young wife looks at her bridegroom. There were rumors that when Nero was 16, she built a room next to hers with a vent and a bed separated only by a thin silk curtain. And many believed Claudius's death, Agrippina's husband, Nero's adoptive father, wasn't just to clear the path for her son's throne. It was so she could be closer to him without a husband's interference. You might think that's just slander from male historians who hated powerful women. But remember, Agrippina wasn't just a mother. She was once Caligula's lover, married 3 times, survived a cutthroat political world, and calmly ordered traitors' heads hung on palace gates. This wasn't a timid woman. This was an emperor trainer who spoke the language of seduction. And Nero, a teenager raised in luxury, knowing no love but manipulative caresses, grew up with a classic confusion that to love is to possess. Their relationship had no clear scenes, no one caught them in the act. But all of Rome knew that when Agrippina entered the palace, Nero stopped breathing, and when she was angry, the young emperor would do anything to be forgiven. Kill a slave, repeal a decree, burn a neighborhood if needed. Once, Agrippina pretended to support another nephew for emperor. When Nero heard, he didn't rage. He cried. He sent her a pearl-encrusted cloak and a handwritten letter with no mother in it. Just 2 words, I miss. From then on, rumors spread that Nero hired actresses to play Agrippina at sex parties, dressed like her, speaking like her, lying in her exact spot on the bed. Perhaps that's why, when he decided to kill her, he hesitated so much. He gave the order 3 times, and the last time, he strangled her himself, crying, kissing her forehead, like when he was a boy. A chaotic death, both a punishment and a lover's farewell. Some say Nero couldn't sleep for nights after, not from regret, but because no one looked at him like Agrippina did. And if you think the depravity stops there, wait until you see who Nero chose to replace her shadow, because in the next part, you'll meet Poppaea, the only woman who made Nero believe he was loved, only for him to kill her with a kick while she carried the child he once longed for. Because love, in Nero's mind, was always a tangle of lulling, controlling, and destroying. And Poppaea, the woman he called Rome's morning light, was the perfect proof of that. If Agrippina was the first, shadowy, terrifying model, Poppaea was the raw, clear, and far more dangerous embodiment, not because she was cruel, but because she was beautiful. Beautiful in a cold, sharp way, and fully aware of the value of softness displayed at the right moment. Nero married Octavia, Claudius's daughter, his first wife, just as he took the throne. Octavia was quiet, dignified, carrying political prestige and royal virginity. But to Nero, she was mere decoration. He hated her from the first night, not because she did anything wrong, but because she did nothing at all. She didn't whisper, didn't cry, didn't beg, didn't create chaos. And to Nero, that was meaningless. He needed emotion, like he needed blood, and Octavia was silent as stone. All of Nero's passion poured into Poppaea, another general's wife, famed for her allure and finesse. Poppaea knew how to say what Nero wanted to hear, when to retreat as he advanced, and how to moan just loud enough to avoid seeming fake. After a few meetings, Nero began dreaming of her. To have her, he banished Octavia, citing infertility, though he never slept with her enough to know. Octavia was exiled to an island, then suffocated with charcoal fumes. But Rome's people loved her, so Nero had her head severed and displayed in the public square to prove she was dead. Then he married Poppaea, a lavish wedding, drenched in wine and desire. They slept in a room lined with mirrors on all sides. Each morning, Nero had servants record Poppaea's breaths as she woke, like a diary of her soul. But like everything with Nero, love never stood still. Stay, he grew suspicious. Poppaea would ask, "Do you love me today?" And Nero began to think she was probing. One day, pregnant, she told Nero to stop yelling at slaves. She needed peace. Nero was silent through dinner. Then he called her to his room, said, "You make me feel like a boy scolded by his mother." Then he kicked her stomach, one blow, no regret. She collapsed, blood soaking her skirt, eyes wide, tearless, and Nero, instead of rushing to her, sat beside her body, whispering, Why don't you react? Are you dead?" Perhaps for the first time, he didn't know whether to grieve or rage, and like with Agrippina, Poppaea's death didn't stop him. He held a state funeral, scattered flowers from the Palatine to the slave market, minted her face on coins, and then went looking for a replacement. But this time, it wasn't a woman. He chose Sporus, a young male slave, with a face eerily like Poppaea's. He had him castrated, dressed in a wedding gown, called him wife. All of Rome was stunned, but no one dared speak, because everyone knew, for Nero, love was an act of destruction. He only loved when he could create and break the image in his mind. Octavia was too quiet, Poppaea too real, Sporus too much like the past. Love was no longer connection, but a stage, and he was director, playwright, audience, suspect, and judge, all on one bed. So in the next part, we'll attend the strangest wedding in Roman history, when the emperor married the shadow of his dead wife, reborn in the form of a castrated teenager, so he could keep sleeping with the past and delude himself that it was love. Because for Nero, only what wasn't real could make him feel safe to embrace. And Sporus, a castrated boy with a face fragile as a Greek statue, was the perfect artificial dream Nero needed. He couldn't find love in the living, in real flesh and blood, in people who could cry from pain or scream in anger. He needed a breathing mannequin, a memory he could hold each night, a shadow obedient enough to never leave, because it no longer had the ability to flee. And that's why Sporus, a slave described as having Poppaea's face but eyes far emptier, became the bride of the Roman emperor. Not a lover, not a plaything, but a wife in a full public wedding ceremony, with crowds, a chariot, a bridal canopy. The wedding was held at the Domus Aurea, the golden palace just completed after Rome's great fire. Nero wore a purple robe, a floral crown, and stepped out among hundreds of guests with a smile unlike any traditional wedding. The smile of a man defying both the world and himself. Sporus, then only about 14 or 15, wore a white silk wedding dress, face powdered, lips painted red like a Greek bride. He didn't speak, didn't cry, didn't smile, just bowed his head and walked. Because the alternative was death, the Romans, accustomed to royal debauchery, still felt chills. Some whispered that Nero was reliving Poppaea. Others said, no, he was marrying a copy to keep punishing the wife who died for not submitting completely. On the wedding night, Nero called Sporus, my love, whispering lines Poppaea once spoke. He made him lie on the left side of the bed, head turned at a precise angle. He ordered servants to prepare perfume identical to Poppaea's hair, and each morning he called his dear wife by a name never repeated in public. because he knew, castrated, dressed up, or reborn, Sporus could never be the real Poppia. But that's why he couldn't betray him. And that was what mattered most. For Nero, real love was dangerous. Real love could resist, refuse, rage, or hurt. Real love could stay silent at the wrong time. But Sporus couldn't. Sporus couldn't bear children, couldn't scream, couldn't criticize. He could only exist in the shape Nero crafted, like a flesh and blood doll, a living memory. And for Nero's mind teetering between reality and stage, that was the only thing that felt safe. Of course, it didn't end with a wedding. Nero took Sporus across provinces, from Naples to Alexandria, Smyrna to Athens. Everywhere he introduced him as empress. Sporus rode in Nero's chariot, ate at his table, slept in his tent. At every stop, Nero staged plays about the sacred love of the lonely emperor and his reborn faithful wife. At banquets, Sporus had to sit where Poppia sat, smile as she smiled, and stay silent as she did before dying. The irony is, in some moments, Nero seemed happy. Once, he paused mid-poetry performance, stepped down, hugged Sporus before the entire hall, and said, "My love, this time I won't kill you." The crowd laughed, but Sporus didn't. Perhaps because he knew, in Nero's heart, love and a death threat were always a breath apart. Or maybe because he realized he was no longer a person, just a role in an endless play, never allowed to leave the stage. But if you think this is the depth of depravity, wait for the next part. Because when sex is no longer a secret, when love is a play repeated forever, the next thing you'll face is the audience. In the next part, we'll step out of the wedding bed and into the forbidden garden, where Nero didn't just make love, but performed it. Amidst torches, flutes, and hundreds of watching eyes, sex became a public ritual, and the bedroom, the ultimate stage of power. With Nero, love was no longer a matter between two people. He needed witnesses. He needed applause. He needed the entire Roman Empire to see what he was doing, who he was dominating, what position he held, so no one would dare question who truly ruled. That's why the Domus Aurea, Nero's golden palace, wasn't just a symbol of luxury after Rome's fire, but a disguised erotic theater where performances of the flesh happened almost nightly. And these weren't frenzied couplings in the dark. They were meticulously staged, like an opera. From music, lighting, scents, to the layout of the space. Yes, you heard right, a layout. Each room in the palace had its own theme: the chamber of Venus weeping, Apollo's nap room, Dionysus's drunken garden. Each was adorned with paintings of gods coupling, ceilings inlaid with pearls, beds fitted with wheels for easy repositioning to change the view. Guests, mostly nobles, philosophers, generals, and favored artists, weren't allowed to decline invitations. They had to attend, had to watch, had to clap at the right moments, hold their breath on cue, and drink wine to Nero's rhythm. On special nights, Nero himself would step out, naked, anointed with oils, wearing a Bacchus mask, and begin to perform. Beside him was Sporus, or a disguised slave, or sometimes two or three at once, depending on his mood. But whoever lay beneath him, the audience always had to lean forward, stifle gasps, and pretend they were witnessing a sacred ritual. Because if you looked away, you insulted the emperor. And if you insulted the emperor, you'd be the performer the next night. Some were dragged onto the stage, or rather, the bed in the grand hall, for pursing their lips. Some girls were forced to undress before their fathers, for muttering. Nero looks so pathetic. In that world, sex wasn't pleasure, it was punishment. A tool of control. A new kind of power. Nero invented, when he realized a sword could instill fear, but a body could instill shame. And it wasn't just real people swept onto that stage. Nero staged puppet shows with human-like dolls that could mate on command. He called it the god's jest. He had busts of former lovers, sculpted to place by the bed when coupling with new ones. One night, he lay still in the main hall, letting dozens of slaves pass by, whispering prayers onto his bare chest, then kissing it. Some fainted from fear, some went mad, some stabbed themselves to avoid a second summons. But the strangest thing is, Nero didn't do it for desire. Not entirely. He wasn't seeking pleasure. He was seeking eyes. Eyes that confirmed he was the center of the universe, that no law was above his body, that no god was more fearsome than his urge to perform, and so, everything was repeated. Repeated until the audience memorized the lines, knew every move, could predict who'd lie where, but no one dared sigh in boredom, because when power and sex became one, boredom itself became a threat. So, to break the cycle, Nero began experimenting with new forms, couplings between man and beast, in costume. A dim-lit wolf marries mermaid show. Another time, he played a goddess being ravished, ordering Sporus, as the god of war, to do it as the histories dictate. And so, while Rome sank in poverty, plague and chaos, at the empire's heart, the emperor was performing a fictional goddess's surrender, with a crooked crown and perfume, mixed with goat's blood. If you're asking, did no one stop him? The answer is no, because everyone was performing with him. And the most dangerous thing isn't when a powerful man goes mad, it's when the entire crowd pretends to enjoy it. But then, like any stage, the lights eventually dim, and Nero would have to find something else, a new way to hold every gaze. And that's when he began using sex as a verdict, not to perform, but to threaten. In the next part, you'll see Nero no longer as an actor, but as a judge, with a whip, with bound bodies, with eyes fixed on another's throat, because when applause no longer satisfied him, only one sound could the sound of begging, and among all those who had to beg, none were more pitiable or terrifying than those without the right to say no. In Nero's Rome, refusal didn't exist in the vocabulary of a slave. They had no voice, no autonomy. They were living objects, able to eat, cry, die, but unable to choose who touched them. And when their master was the emperor, the price of shaking their head was their life. To Nero, slaves weren't people. They were secondary stages, replaceable props, the backdrop for his artistic and lustful life. Each day, among the hundreds serving at the Domus Aurea, a list of names was chosen to attend the emperor, not to serve food, but to serve his body, men and women, adults and youths, and their duty began with absolute silence. They couldn't ask questions, couldn't moan, couldn't shed tears before Nero, unless signaled, because tears had to be timed, and pain had to be beautiful. Nero once said, "A slave who cries at the right moment is worth more than a good poem." He wasn't joking. A girl from Britannia, with hair golden as ripe wheat and skin white as wax, was assigned the role of violated virgin goddess in one night's performance. Terrified, she stood there, until Nero personally painted a streak of fake blood on her thigh and whispered, "Now you truly belong to Rome." After that night, she was rewarded with a bracelet. Then she vanished. No one saw her again. Another young man, described as beautiful as a marble statue, was summoned mid-banquet. Nero said, "Say no." The boy hesitated, shaking his head. Nero smiled, then turned to the crowd. "See, even when I ask to be refused, they don't dare." Then he ordered the boy, whipped on the spot. The crowd laughed, but no one saw him afterward. And that was the sentence for those not allowed to refuse, to live not as people, to die not as corpses. To serve Nero, they had to become mirrors reflecting his exact desires, not a glance off, not a moan misplaced, because if they deviated, if they erred, if they strayed from his vision, the performance would fail. And when a performance failed, Nero never blamed the director. He dealt with the actors. You might think, why not flee? Why not escape that hell? They couldn't. In Rome, slaves weren't just controlled by shackles. They were controlled by law. A slave involved with the emperor, willingly or not, would be deemed unlawfully intimate, if not publicly sanctioned. And that meant, if he touched you without announcing it, you couldn't speak. If he touched you and announced it, you had to thank him. If you refused, you committed treason. Some slaves knew this. They learned to perform correctly. They drew lessons from those before them, and sometimes trained those who came after. There was a secret oral system on how to breathe short 3 times, so he'd skip the rape part. One night, in the kitchen behind the Domus Aurea, a girl was heard teaching a younger one how to tie a scarf into a heart shape, so Nero would like it, and not make her strip immediately. By morning, both were gone, but the worst wasn't the loss. It was the silence that followed, because no one dared mention them, no one dared ask, no one dared remember, because remembering meant realizing you could be next. In that world, refusal was a luxury. Saying no was declaring war. And for an emperor who proved his power by silencing others in pain, the word no, even whispered, was rebellion. Nero didn't need consent, he needed roles, and those roles only ended when he decided. So if you think you still had choices in his Rome, wait for the next part, where sex was no longer coercion, no longer performance, but training. Where children raised in the imperial palace weren't taught to learn, but trained to moan on cue, bow just right, and die without disrupting the feast. Because to Nero, there were no victims, only actors who hadn't learned their lines. And if the script demanded you moan, you moaned. If it demanded you die, you died. Your body was no longer yours. It was a prop, a tool, a lump of material carved, molded, arranged to fit the emperor's vision on the throne. Not a biological body, but a political one. A performing body. A body without will, only function, to reflect another's desire. In the perfumed corridors of the Domus Aurea, there were countless such bodies, beautiful, silent, clean, and nameless, shaved from neck to ankle, anointed with orange blossom oil, lined up in rooms with mirrored ceilings. Nero passed them like a collector, touching one's cheek, nodding at another, sometimes not bothering to look. Once, he said, "I don't sleep with anyone. I create art on breathing objects." That line was recorded in a philosopher's diary from that night's feast. Breathing objects. That's how he saw others. No gender, no personality, no soul, just skin, muscle, eyes, mouth, arranged to please the eye, the hand, and most importantly, the emperor's mood. And like all objects, they were discarded when broken. A young dancer named Lycos, famed for bending like a serpent, was chosen to perform by Nero's bed each night for months. But that autumn, Lycos sprained his shoulder, unable to lift his leg over his head as usual. Nero ordered his shoulder flayed, to see what's wrong inside. He died 2 days later. His body wasn't buried but thrown into a lotus pond, so the water gods could feel unfinished art. Nero didn't cry, he shrugged. I hate imperfection. Other bodies were discarded more quietly. A girl chosen as Venus for a 2-week performance series was told to starve to maintain her figure. She fainted while being painted with makeup. Nero raged, saying she ruined the aesthetic of the show. She vanished from the palace that day. In the court's etiquette ledger, her name was crossed out in red ink with a single note, no longer fit to perform. Some bodies were permanently altered for fleeting roles. A muscular male slave was castrated to play the goddess of the night. A woman was painted entirely in liquid gold to play the sun. She died after the show from chemical burns. Nero stared at her body all morning, then whispered to himself, "This is the light that never sets." You think that's madness. You're not wrong, but it was organized madness. Madness adorned with gemstones, silk, and poetry. Madness with an audience. And that's what set Nero apart from ordinary tyrants. He didn't kill for the thrill of murder, he killed for aesthetic need, and human bodies, alive or dead, were just pigment in his palette of desire. But what pushed it beyond the line wasn't how he saw others. It was how people began to see each other that way. Roman nobles started imitating him, hosting feasts with slaves painted in dye, actors bound as living lamps, girls shaped like pottery to sit at the table's center. Nero created a trend, and that trend was dehumanization. In a society where bodies were tools, emotions were a burden, and anyone who still felt pity was deemed not refined enough. That's when Rome began rotting from within, not from inflation, not from rebellion, but because people no longer knew what a human was. And amid that chaos, Nero sat on his throne, sketching the ideal body for the role of winter lover in his next performance. It needed pale green skin, short hair, purple eyes, and to achieve that, he had to craft it from real flesh and bone. In the next part, you'll see how a living body was transformed, layer by layer, to embody a vision only Nero could see. Because when desire no longer sought pleasure, but only an idea, every living being was sculpted into something it wasn't. And sometimes, death wasn't the most terrifying thing. It was continuing to live, as a decorative object in the madness of the one in power. But in Nero's Rome, even the privilege of continuing to live wasn't guaranteed to all. Some bodies didn't survive a single performance. Some faces, having moaned their final line, were snuffed out forever. Some corpses were dragged off stage, no one asking their names, no one recording, no one remembering who they were. Because to Nero, a person's death wasn't an event, it was the conclusion of a subpar performance. In the system of bodily rituals he created, people died like they fell off the stage, quietly, quickly replaced in an instant. Behind the domiceria, there was an unmarked plot, not shown on any palace blueprint. Servants called it the Garden of No Names. It was where the bodies of those who failed Nero's performances were dumped. No tombstones, no rites, not even shrouds, just dirt, grass, and the stench of rotting flesh mixed with incense. They say at night you could hear sobs from there, not from ghosts, but from those about to be taken there. An Egyptian dancer, her true name never recorded, was chosen to dance blindfolded at a banquet, silver chains dangling from each finger. When she slipped on blood from a whipped slave nearby, Nero was furious. He called her dance, uncontrolled, then ordered one of her hands cut off, so no one mistakes her for art again. She died from blood loss. Her body was rolled in a floor rug and tossed into the garden. No one recorded it. No one dared ask. A curly-haired teenager, face beautiful as a bronze statue, was summoned to play a mythical lover in a reenactment of a Greek legend. He was hung upside down on a wooden frame, chest coated in honey, to lure the bees of love. Nero's words. He stopped breathing before the climax. Nero coolly said, "This play needs a sad ending." His body was thrown into a fish pond right after the feast. The fish died over 3 days from blood diluting the water. No one mentioned his name again. Some deaths went unremembered, not because they were small, but because they were too common, like smoke rising from a hearth each morning, like a sob in the middle of a song, like darkness behind bursts of applause. In Nero's world, death wasn't an end. It was an edit, a replacement, a stage-clearing step for the next scene to flow smoothly. And so, the more people died, the smoother things ran. No hitches, no interruptions, no distractions from the center of every performance. Him. The most horrific thing was that no one objected. On the contrary, some tried to die beautifully, to die after a successful performance, to die in the emperor's gaze as a way to be recognized, to breathe their last while still wearing makeup, with perfume on their wrists. Because in that Rome, surviving was sometimes more shameful than dying while still shining. A young poet once wrote, "If this body isn't seen by Nero, let it burn in fire rather than fade in oblivion." He set himself ablaze outside the palace gates. Nero ordered his ashes brought back, mixed into red ink, used to write love letters to Sporus. That was Rome, a city where bodies became material, an empire where every death was turned into aesthetics, as long as it didn't stink too long, a world where names mattered less than scenery. And Nero, amidst it all, kept writing scripts, kept choosing people, kept auditioning, kept saying, "Not bad, but the eyes are too real." He didn't want real. He wanted right, right for the fantasy in his head, right for his obsession with beauty that didn't dare move, and to achieve that, no number of bodies was too many. In the next part, we'll dive deeper into that mind, where a light touch had to hit the right beat, where a mistimed moan could be a sentence, where the so-called art of love crossed the line between passion and torture to become something even more terrifying, a ritual of power, control, and destruction. Because to Nero, no pleasure was perfect, unless it made someone cry. And if tears didn't fall from emotion, let them fall from pain. In his hands, the so-called art of love wasn't about connecting two souls, but controlling a body, bending a will, distorting a mind. Every caress, every glance, every kiss had rhythm, composition, climax, and conclusion, like a symphony. But instead of strings, he used a whip. Instead of candlelight, he used a cold stare. Instead of words of love, he used commands. To those who never met the emperor, Nero's bedroom antics might seem like an endless chain of pleasure, but the truth was different. It was a meticulously calculated process, where every emotion was controlled down to the breath. Before each performance, the victim, or rather the subject, had to be bathed in water scented with sandalwood, their skin softened with almond oil mixed with myrrh, their mouth held herbs to lighten breathing, so moans wouldn't sound coarse, their eyes dripped with belladonna essence to look more dazed. And when all was ready, Nero entered, not rushed, not impulsive, but like a director checking the lighting. Sometimes, he touched no one. He just sat, watched, graded. "This role lacks trembling," he'd remark. "That one looks like it's thinking of something else." And then, cut, do it again. Sometimes it lasted all night just to achieve one perfect moment, where the other had to flinch at the right time, sob the right line, and even stop breathing for a beautifully timed instant. It was no longer physical intimacy. It was choreographed pain. In bedrooms designed like stages, Nero installed pulley systems to hoist people to the ceiling, adjusting angles to cast shadows like sculptures. Each performance had a theme: Venus's betrayal, Apollo's regret, the death of a young lover. Depending on the theme, the subject might be forced to hold a silver chain in their mouth, be bound with red ribbons at the wrists, or lie still for 2 hours in a highly aesthetic pose. Many said the worst pain wasn't the violence, but the emptiness. You didn't know if you were being loved, hated, or just a test stroke in his unfinished painting. One victim recalled, "He stroked my hair for 30 minutes. I thought I was safe. But when I asked, 'What do you want me to do?' he just said, 'You ruined a beautiful moment,' then left." Another girl, chosen for the role of punished traitor, was forced to smile while being whipped. No crying, no begging, just smiling, brightly. Because Nero believed only when pain is wrapped in laughter does it touch art. She smiled until blood ran from her lips, then fainted, but wasn't saved, because the play wasn't over. You might think this is torture. It was, but in Rome it was called by prettier names: rite of grace, art of the body, the supreme expression of imperial power through emotion. And they painted these performances on pottery, drew them on bathhouse walls, tattooed them on skin like medals. Those chosen to perform the art of love with the emperor were even seen as greatly honored, though the outcome was lameness, madness, or death. Nero succeeded in blurring the line between pleasure and torture, between desire and violence, between love and punishment. And he didn't do it alone. He did it with the silent complicity of a blinded society, with the bowed heads of courtiers, with the cautious applause of those who survived tonight but weren't sure about tomorrow. But, like all rituals, it had to be repeated. And when the old ceased to feel fresh, Nero began seeking things no one dared touch: grotesque combinations, unimaginable moments, scenes of love no longer involving people, but what remained after their dignity was stripped away. In the next part, you'll see Nero create new concepts of sex, beyond gender, species, structure. Because when no one dared stop him, the only thing he still wanted to break was the order of creation itself. And he began that rebellion in the unlikeliest place, the public bathhouse, where Romans went daily to wash off the dust, to chat, to discuss politics, now turned into a machine for producing pleasure, a disguised sex factory where every hot tile, every steam cloud, every shadowed corner served the bodily performances Nero called natural practice. In Rome, bathhouses weren't private. Men and women usually bathed at different times, but during special performances hosted by the emperor, all rules were torn apart. Nero ordered a private sauna complex, built within the Domus Aurea, but forbade anyone from calling it a bathhouse. He called it the body preparation room. No doors, no limits, just heat, resinous scents, and the sound of running water as background music. There, the models, slaves, or selected actors had to wait in order, each led in one by one, bathed in warm goat's milk, scrubbed by 2 people at once. Nero liked to watch from a distance, through a thin curtain, silent, motionless, just observing. And when the subject was clean and soft enough, he'd step in. Sometimes he touched nothing, just sat nearby, ordering them to turn, lift their head, bend, soak, exhale. He liked controlling others like playing an instrument, with his eyes. But most of the time, this wasn't a place for rest. It was an audition chamber. Those who smiled at the right moment, bowed at the right angle, lifted their face on cue, were chosen for the main performance. Those who trembled, frowned, or turned away when touched were sent to the steam release area, a euphemism for the punishment room. A sealed chamber, no light, only cold water, whips, and the stench of fear. Those who emerged, if they survived, no longer looked human. Once, a Greek girl, new and not understanding Latin, smiled when Nero entered. He took it as mockery. He had hot wax poured on her stomach, then threw her into a cold pool to learn to take beauty seriously. The last time she was seen was in a Winter's Wrath performance, standing in the bathhouse, draped in a wet, icy cloak, face expressionless. No one asked if she survived that night. No one dared care. And so, the bathhouse became a place of fate. People didn't go there to get clean. They went to be seen, to be noted, to be chosen, or discarded. Slaves began learning to move smoothly through the steam, keep breaths short, but not rushed, and above all, don't react if touched intimately. Treat it like a breeze. These were survival tips, skills to endure in a society where your body no longer belonged to you. Nero didn't just turn the bathhouse into a stage, he turned it into an assembly line of emotions. Each person brought in was a half-finished product. After being cleaned, polished, checked for skin softness, whiteness, elasticity, they were taken to the testing room, where he decided who was worthy of appearing in the night's performances. No different from an industrial sex factory. But the difference was, the products could feel pain, and when the bathhouse became too familiar, Nero innovated further. He had resin poured on the floor, so people would slip gracefully. He added pepper to the steam to make victims' eyes redden, like they'd cried for love. He built high platforms overlooking the baths, so guests could admire from above, and those assigned to bathe below had to wash, recite love poetry, and hold alluring poses all at once. Some couldn't bear the pressure. Some slipped, hit their heads, fainted. But the show went on. No one could stop, because stopping meant disrupting the rhythm the emperor created. And when Nero lost interest, the punished weren't just the failures, but those standing nearby, because in his eyes, a faulty product meant the whole assembly line was to blame. You think this is outrageous? Absurd? No. This was Rome, where depravity was inlaid with marble, hung with golden lamps, and justified by art. In the next part, you'll see Nero not only controlling individual bodies, he wanted to command entire spaces. When bedrooms, bathhouses, and performance halls grew too small for his delusions, Nero took sex to the streets, to the arenas, to the grandstands, and turned all of Rome into a giant body he could invade at will. But the problem is, once you possess everything, you grow bored with the very power you hold. For Nero, desire was never about touching. It was about what he hadn't touched. He wasn't captivated by beautiful bodies, but by the thrill of controlling what couldn't be had. He didn't need more lovers, he needed more boundaries to break. That's why after every orgy, every carnal performance, every night of love, hailed as art, he still lay awake, eyes wide, muttering, "Not enough, still not enough." The syndrome of wanting only what's out of reach, that was the addiction to power cloaked in desire. And in Nero, it was a bottomless void. He once said, when a woman gives herself, she's no longer a mystery. When a man submits, he's no longer a challenge. So, the only thing keeping him alive was hunting what no one dared touch. And it wasn't people anymore. It was sensations, positions, scripts never written before. He wanted to conquer in stadiums, amid the cheers of tens of thousands. He wanted to place a couple on the highest platform in the arena and order them to make love, as if dying. He wanted to shatter every norm of place, time, context. One afternoon, he halted his entire entourage in a crowded street, amid the fish market, among the shouts of the crowd. There, surrounded by heaps of mackerel and rags, he ordered a female slave to lie down, strip, and commanded a musician to observe her every expression to compose background music. He didn't touch her, he just stood there, watching, like a deranged director, chasing a moment no one dared imagine. One night, disguised in a commoner's cloak, he wandered into the slums, found a scrawny boy sleeping by a cold pot of porridge. He said, "I want you to look at me without knowing who I am." The boy, terrified, ran. Nero laughed, but the next morning, the boy was caught, brought to the palace, and chained in a private room. Nero said, "Now you'll learn to look at me without turning away." From then on, the boy had to eat and sleep in a sealed room, where the only light came from a small hole in the ceiling. And whenever Nero peered through, the boy had to smile. No crying, no questions, just smile. Because Nero's greatest obsession wasn't a lack of lovers. It was a lack of eyes looking at him the right way. He wanted frightened eyes, quivering lips, hearts beating off rhythm, skin prickling with chills. He didn't want love. He wanted to be the god of uncontrolled emotions. Every pleasure had to come with loss of control. Every tremor had to carry the scent of danger, and every climax had to be paired with a choked sob of shame or pain. Love, if it existed, had to have blood. Without blood, it wasn't real. He grew bored with obedient, soft bodies. He hated resigned eyes. He ruined bodies that were too compliant. Once, a woman chosen for being untouched by anyone disappointed Nero by being too docile. He said, "You don't resist me. You don't moan. You just lie there, like you're waiting for orders." Then he walked away, calling in a guard to take his place. Not because he no longer wanted her, but because he craved yearning, not readiness. The problem with those who have everything is that nothing makes them yearn anymore, so they must create what no one has, what shouldn't exist. And for Nero, that meant smashing every limit. The limit of bodies, the limit of will, the limit of society, even the limit of creation itself. In the next part, you'll see Nero no longer satisfied with orgies. He wanted to create something new, an ideal lover, not by searching the crowd, but by crafting one. He would blend the body of a corpse with an imagined soul, resurrect the shadow of the past, and name it, like a god creating Adam. But this time, the creation had no right to refuse, no right to die, no right to live. It could only obey, because for Nero, what he loved most was what didn't exist, and he would create it at any cost. But creating an ideal lover wasn't as simple as sculpting a statue or dressing up a corpse. It required a real soul, slowly distorted, step-by-step programmed, trained not to live, but to perform. And that's how a boy, about 13, was brought to the palace in the dead of night, nameless, without papers, without kin, simply called the draft. He didn't know where he came from. Only that after a long hunger, a man in a purple cloak found him by the Tiber River, put him in a covered cart, and told him not to ask, speak, or sleep without orders. When he opened his eyes, he was in the Domus Aurea. The first room had no windows, but mirrors on all sides. He was told to stand in the center, strip naked, and smile. If the smile was wrong, he'd be struck. If his stance was off, his legs would be pulled until the shape met requirements. No one called him by his real name, because real names were for humans. He was called Stillness, Dawn, or Dream Eyes, depending on the role Nero would play with him. Each day, he was taught to breathe in rhythm, to widen his eyes just enough to suggest innocence, to swallow silently, to lie still for 10 minutes without trembling when touched. He was fed twice, slept 4 hours, and when not training, he had to stand in a reminiscence pose, arms clutching his chest, eyes down, head slightly tilted, because the ideal lover is always pensive, Nero said. On the first night, he was given a purple liquid, sweet like fermented grapes, to feel at ease, a servant said. Then he was laid on a bed, in a cold room, surrounded by 20 burning wax lamps, with a cup of someone's hair placed by the headboard. Nero entered, wearing a thin robe, saying nothing. He just looked like he was inspecting a work, like he was judging the first brushstroke. The boy understood nothing, only that staying still earned him bread. Turning his head cost a finger, and so he lay still. Day by day, night by night, he was trained to react like Poppaea, to cry like Agrippina, to smile like Sporus, and when Nero touched him, he had to moan softly like an Eastern maiden. Because dreams have no gender, Nero whispered. The boy slowly forgot how to speak, genuinely, forgot his face in the mirror, forgot where the role ended, and he began. One day, when a servant handed him a cracked wax mask with a faint smile, he asked, "Who is this?" The servant replied, "It's you, when you're perfect." And he wore that mask every night, reenacting every moment of love Nero had lost, from the first embrace to the kick, to Poppaea's stomach, from his mother's kiss to the wedding night with Sporus, all replayed on his body. No deviations, no delays, not a tear out of time. Once he trembled during a pain of the traitor scene while being choked. Nero stopped, stood, and said, "No, you're not him. You're the dream, and dreams don't fear." After that night, the boy was locked up for a week, hearing only Nero's voice through a vent, to memorize the rhythm of the dream. Some say he died after 5 months. Others say he was freed when Nero found a more suitable vessel. But all records of him vanished. No one knew his name. No one knew his origin. Only a cracked mask was found after Nero's death, hanging in a room where light never entered. That was the fate of the draft. A boy forced to perform a lifelong role he never chose. In the next part, you'll meet the final versions, those not forced, but willing, those ready to trade their souls just to be touched by Nero, even once. Because depravity, when pushed too far, doesn't just destroy victims. It creates those who crave to be victims. And that's when sex, meant to be instinct, became a tool of rule. No longer a private game behind locked doors, no longer a clandestine pastime in the night, but policy, a diplomatic strategy, a means to secure the throne, subdue rivals, and control Rome's entire machinery, with desire twisted to its core. Nero quickly grasped a simple truth. In an empire built on fear and worship, nothing was more effective than an emperor both desired and dreaded. He didn't need to kill if he could make people tremble with a glance. Didn't need decrees if he could paralyze the Senate by choosing who got touched. Sex became a system for selecting loyalty. Whoever spent a night with the emperor, even just to massage, burn incense, or pour wine, was instantly elevated to national benefactor. Conversely, those refused, pushed aside, or worse, forgotten, were finished. Once, a veteran general who quelled a revolt in Gaul, after saying the emperor grows more womanly by the day, was summoned back, not for execution, but to watch Nero couple with 3 male slaves in front of him. No one touched him, no one insulted him with words. But after that night, he resigned, shaved his head, and exiled himself. Simply because he understood, he no longer stood on the stage of power. He was outside the theater, and a faint laugh was enough to be erased from the game. Similarly, many young nobles, knowing the rules, offered themselves to the emperor, not for love, not under duress, but for ambition. A glance from Nero could turn a nobody into a governor. A touch from him could elevate a family to nobility. But to gain that glory, you had to perform. You had to learn to cry out in pain convincingly, to beg without dampening his mood, to act surprised despite knowing the script. Some practiced before mirrors for months to perfect their summoned night expressions. Some applied oil to their lips daily, kept their voices dreamy, moved slowly, to look both wounded and ready to be wounded again. And Nero knew it all. He knew they were acting. But he still chose, because the only thing that excited him wasn't sex. It was the thrill of choking someone who thought they were smarter. A young philosopher, Leontius, famed for speeches against societal decay, was invited to a private feast, not to debate, but to undress. No one forced him, no one threatened, but Nero just looked and said, "I hear you hate me. So tonight, teach me your ideals, with your body." Leontius was silent, then stripped, then knelt. 3 months later, he lost his voice, wrote a book praising Nero as Rome's light of freedom. No one mentioned his earlier speeches, because Nero's power wasn't in turning enemies into corpses, it was in turning them into mirrors of submission. He used sex as a proclamation. No one but I controls pleasure. No one but I decides who feels shame, who feels bliss. Even with vassal states, he applied this principle. Eastern envoys arriving in Rome, besides offering gold and silver, were tested for loyalty by joining private performances, where their bodies became bargaining tools. Those who flinched were listed as untrustworthy. Those who moaned on cue secured treaties. And if you think Nero only used this on outsiders, you're wrong. He tested it even on his own kin. Rumors said a cousin was called to his private chambers for 3 weeks, just to discuss music theory. Afterward, the cousin killed himself. No one dared ask why, and because everyone feared, Nero kept going. Sex became currency, a form of punishment, a political weapon. No blood needed, no armies, just a look, a summons, and a locked room. In the next part, you'll see the consequences of ruling by pleasure, when the entire court became an endless incestuous play, when honor no longer rested on merit, but on who slept with whom and who didn't moan loudly enough. And you'll understand, Rome didn't fall to enemies, it fell to the hurried breaths behind the emperor's velvet curtains. But more terrifying than the emperor was the audience. Because in Nero's empire, spectators had roles too. They didn't just sit and watch. They participated by staying silent, by laughing on cue, by never asking, Why is he doing this? And every nod, every round of applause, every admiring glance was the foundation that let the depraved play drag on. They were the complicit collective. No one was forced to stay in the auditorium, but no one left, because leaving meant losing chances for advancement, losing shares of wealth, losing a place in court. So they learned to live with disgust. They turned horror into aesthetics. They praised blood like a new paint color. They called sex art, and the worst part, they believed it was true. At palace feasts, when Nero signaled, a couple would step into the center, starting the performance. It could be two slaves, two nobles, child and an adult. Depending on the night's whim, the audience sat around, raising wine glasses, chatting softly as if at a concert. Anyone who moaned off rhythm was scolded. Anyone pretending not to look was noted as disharmonious. Once, an elderly noblewoman glanced away when Nero kissed a boy at the banquet table. The next morning, her home was confiscated. She vanished. Her name was erased from court records. They said she was replaced by someone who better appreciated art. Spectators weren't allowed to be people. They had to be extensions of the script. They had to laugh when Nero laughed, cry when he pouted, hold their breath when he moaned softly, and if he suddenly raged, they had to kneel, feigning apologies, though they didn't know their fault. That's why Rome became a giant stage, where no one was truly a spectator, all were actors. And that created a collective disease, conditional complicity. If I'm not the one choked tonight, it's fine. If my family still gets spoils after the show, it's okay. If I moan softly enough, I'm safe. But they weren't safe. Because Nero didn't seek submission, he sought resistance. Because only when you resisted could he crush you. Only when you raised your face could he justify choking you, without seeming cruel. Once, at a special performance, Nero had a rotating grandstand built. Each time he moved, the entire audience spun to match his perspective. Anyone who lost balance fell from their seat. Dozens tumbled like game pieces, while he laughed and said, "That's life. Always adapt to the center." Those who fell that day were listed for lacking the mettle to sit in the emperor's world, and then replaced. Some didn't fall but failed to laugh on cue, also erased. No one asked why. Because in Nero's theater, you couldn't be a spectator. You had to be scenery, an echo, a supporting effect, the gentle breeze when he spoke of loneliness. And because everyone understood this, they competed to be scenery, to fall in the right direction, to cry on rhythm. One young man mixed blood with honey for fake tears, to be authentic. A woman practiced clenching her stomach to fake a sob, to earn Nero's praise for depth. And Nero clapped, smiled, looked down at them, like a garden of bowing flowers. But the more who bowed, the more bored he grew. He didn't want a garden, he wanted a rebellious forest, to burn. In the next part, you'll see the danger when all are actors, but none dare write a new script, when every role is repetition, when every cry is a prop, when even pain is mimicked. What will Nero do to sap the bloodlust evaporating from his mind? The answer lies in a staged death, a beautiful death, a death with an audience, a death with a script, and real blood. And when every death could be staged like a performance, the nobles had no reason to live as anything but bizarre actors. They no longer distinguished morality from depravity, a feast from a funeral rite. Under Nero's reign, Rome's elite slid into a fever of boundless debauchery, not because they lacked shame, but because shame no longer had consequences. On the contrary, it became a new accessory. The more perverse, the more noteworthy. Nobles, once the rational stewards of the empire, now were reluctant pornographic performers, displaying their bodies, emotions, and honor to survive. Some held weddings for dogs, just to make Nero laugh. A governor had his penis carved onto a war medal, sent to the emperor with the caption, "Grant your servant one night as backdrop." At a feast called the Festival of Flesh, all guests stripped naked, anointed with orange blossom oil, and were required to eat with their mouths, no hands. The winner would lie on the table for the emperor to step over, like a god over mankind. No one refused. Some hired slaves with collars inscribed, "If I don't please you, behead me at the market gate." These acts didn't come from Nero, but from the fear and ambition of the elite themselves. They burned themselves to stand near the light, knowing it incinerated everything. A noblewoman, once an advisor to Nero's mother, once Rome's most powerful woman, petitioned to become the emperor's spiritual wet nurse, meaning reading him praises of himself nightly naked, one hand bound. A group of poets formed the Moaners for the Fatherland Society, where each had to compose a short poem while coupling, and the one that made Nero moan first won a vineyard. Depravity no longer lay in actions, it lay in the logic. No one wanted dignity, because dignity brought no reward, and the only reward in Rome then was to live. They didn't need respect, they just needed not to be forgotten. They didn't need love, they needed to be seen. Nero turned everything into an immoral game, and like all games, the more they played, the less they wanted to stop. Great noble families held blood offering nights, slicing their hands before Nero to prove loyalty. Some had their 12-year-old daughters learn belly dancing with candles between their knees, just to be summoned when the emperor was sad. And Nero, he didn't need to command. He just sat on his throne, watching like a bored god, as humans set themselves ablaze for warmth. He only had to say, "I'm tired of pretense," and the court would compete to be more genuinely pained, more bloody, more ruthless. No one was human anymore. They were talking, moaning, crawling on knees puppets if praised as sincere. And when those meant to steer the empire became beasts in the emperor's zoo, Rome was just a giant gilded cage, rotting from within. The most dangerous thing was the masses started copying. When nobles groveled for attention, commoners began thinking, if I'm depraved enough, maybe I'll be seen. And so Rome lost its classes. It had only roles. In the next part, you'll see the consequences of a society where all act, all flaunt flesh, all wail by script, until no one knows what's real. When citizens hold public mating feasts, when children learn to perform pleasure before reading, when the line between king and slave is only the length of a shared night, Nero no longer needed to burn Rome, because Rome was already burning itself from within. But perhaps the strangest thing of all was when the fire starter demanded to be the fuel. When the emperor, who owned every body, every gaze, every moan, began craving to become a slave, not out of remorse, not to atone, but because for someone who held all power, all forms of domination, all versions of control, the only way to feel something truly new was to flip the board, to be controlled, humiliated, choked like a sex toy by the hands of those who once knelt at his feet. On a moonless night, Nero's closest mute servant, trained from childhood to never reveal anything, was ordered to prepare a special room. No throne, no flowers, no music, just an iron cage, a set of chains, a horsewhip, and a masked man dressed as a slave. The man was chosen from hundreds of war prisoners, tall, muscular, with wild eyes. His sole task, treat Nero like an animal. And so it began, a new kind of ritual. The emperor knelt, hands bound behind his back, head bowed to the ground, hips raised, no speaking, no commanding, only receiving orders. And if he performed poorly, he'd be struck. Not pretend, not staged, real, skin torn, blood flowing, moans no longer background music, but consequence. At first, the masked man hesitated, but Nero roared, hit harder. I didn't come here to be caressed. I came to be destroyed. And the next lash tore his back. Blood splattered the stone walls. Gasping breaths echoed. Nero moaned, not from pain, but from ecstasy. In that moment, he wasn't the emperor. He was the one decided, a naked body in the hands of someone who didn't need to know who he was, and that thrilled him. Some nights, he summoned 3 male slaves, ordering them to take turns humiliating him with vulgar insults. He lay on the floor, letting them step on his face, spit in his mouth, call him the empire's old whore. Afterward, he sat up, smiled, and said, "Thank you, I just felt truly alive." But this role reversal didn't stay in the locked room. Nero brought it to the court. He held role swap events, where slaves sat in chairs while nobles stood as servants, where a gatekeeper could scold a consul, where a woman once raped could slap the face of someone who clapped as she was shamed. Just a game, Nero said. A new kind of entertainment. Social order needs flipping to refresh sensation. But everyone knew, with him, nothing was just. Everything was ritual. And in those rituals, he found pleasure, not in being dominated, but in watching himself erased, Perhaps because deep down, Nero knew the true ruler wasn't the one on the throne, but the one who decided when to raise their face and when to bow. By willingly becoming a slave, he proved he couldn't be overthrown, because he overthrew himself first. Once, in the slave market, Nero disguised himself as a condemned criminal, holding a sign, Rome's discard. He knelt in the square, letting the crowd curse, throw food, spit. But instead of fear, he laughed. Laughed like a man who'd discovered the ultimate secret. No one could touch him if he threw himself down first, as if, by hitting rock bottom, he climbed to a new peak. But this game didn't just satisfy Nero, it planted seeds of new delusions in the crowd. Slaves, once silenced, now knew they could command. Those who knelt now tasted sitting in chairs, and once they tasted that place, they wouldn't easily return to being scenery. In the next part, you'll see Nero lose control in the very role swap ritual he created. When one of the masters refused to remove the mask, refused to step back, refused to return the role, when pretense became real, when the script was overstepped, and for the first time, Nero couldn't remove the chains, couldn't remove the fear, couldn't remove himself. Because what Nero didn't foresee was this: when you play a game with power for too long, there comes a moment when you can't tell what's acting and what's real. When everyone wears a mask, even you aren't sure if you still have a real face. And that was the moment Nero slipped into the worst state of any power addict, the feeling of never enough. Not because he lacked, but because he had too much. Too many bodies to choose from, too many gazes to control, too many moans to edit, until everything blurred, diluted, tasteless. Each time he touched a new body, he felt nothing. Each time he humiliated someone, he heard an empty drum in his head. Emotion vanished. The shiver no longer came. His heart didn't race as before. The nights that once thrilled him to tears were now just a series of soulless motions. Like a dish he once craved, still perfectly spiced, beautifully presented, steaming hot, but he chewed without tasting. He tried changing people, no effect. Tried changing settings, still the same. Tried switching roles from dominator to victim, still not enough. Each climax was a longer slide into a hidden sadness. Why don't I feel anything anymore? He whispered to the mirror one night. Why doesn't that body make me tremble? No one answered, because the only one who dared speak truthfully had killed themselves long ago. Some say that one summer night, Nero had 5 of the palace's most beautiful people, stripped naked, arranged in a star shape, under red lamplight. He circled them, studying each face, each breath, each deliberately dazed gaze. But instead of arousal, he sat down and wept, not sobbing, not writhing, just silent tears falling to the floor. "You're too beautiful," he said, "but I feel nothing." Then he stood and left. No one dared touch him that day. From then on, Nero sought what he once called repulsive, the stench of blood, animal carcasses, unscripted screams. He built a room of mirrors, where each act of sex was a chance to see himself from every angle. But even that didn't free him from the void. He tried choral pleasure, inviting 10 people at once, making them breathe, moan, and fake climax in unison to create a symphony of desire. But he laughed mid-act, like a choir of the dead, he said. The uniform moans felt like a tomb. He was no longer hungry, no longer intoxicated, no longer pained, no longer pleasured. The only thing left in him was a vast emptiness, wrapped in gold, silk, and soothing music, the feeling of never enough. That was the curse of one who'd gone too far in conquest. That was the end of the pleasure curve, when every peak felt the same, every conquest became shallow. Nero began seeing everyone as identical. Man or woman, slave or noble, young or old, all just moving flesh, making noise, feigning arousal. He said, "The human body is a maze. I've explored it all. Now I just repeat the corridors." And he was tired, not physically, but mentally, with nowhere left to aim. He started having strange dreams. In them, he was a child locked in a box, surrounded by thousands of naked people clapping, but none touching him. He screamed, but no one heard. He cried, but no one cared. And when he woke, he felt normal, as if the nightmare was reality, and waking was just a prolonged hallucination. In the next part, you'll see Nero seek a new escape from that bottomless void, a different addiction. Not sex, not power, but destruction. When all pleasures fade, only blood has real color, and only the final scream can't be faked. That's when Nero realized what he needed wasn't pleasure, but rejection. He needed someone to refuse him, deny him, reject him utterly, so he'd have a reason to destroy. Because in a world where everyone offered themselves, moaned on cue, bowed for survival, only the one who said no could make his heart beat again. And he began searching for that person, not to love, but to kill. A bold no in the humid air of desire was the most thrilling sound he'd ever heard. There was a girl, young, beautiful, intelligent, never seen at any palace feast, who caught his eye for one reason: she refused. When summoned to dine with the emperor, she told the messenger plainly, "I don't serve any man who killed his mother." That sentence struck Nero like lightning. No one dared say that. No one dared mention Agrippina. No one dared call him a traitorous son. And so, she instantly became his target. But not in the usual way. Nero didn't order her arrest, didn't execute her, didn't rape her. Instead, he invited her to a play called She and the White Knight. In it, she'd be the star, and the entire court the audience. The opening was an outdoor feast. The table held dishes mimicking human organs, pig intestines stuffed with clotted blood, goose liver sliced like facial skin, bread red as a slit throat. She was invited to the seat of honor. No one bound her, no one forced her, but all eyes were on her. She may choose, eat or don't, Nero said. But remember, refusal is a form of consent to death. The girl didn't eat. She sat upright, staring into his eyes, and smiled. A smile not inviting, not defiant, not afraid, simply, "I don't care." Nero froze. His heart beat again. It had been so long since he saw someone not playing a role, and that made him want to devour her. But how to consume without breaking? How to kill so the pain lingered? He stretched the play over 3 nights. Each night, a new corridor, a new setting, a mirrored room, a room of howling wind, a room with blood-oozing walls. The girl was paraded like a queen, but no one dared touch her, because Nero ordered, "No one ruins her before I lay hands." On the final night, he wore a black robe, held a cup of serpent wine, and entered a room with only her. "Kneel," he said, "not for me, but for yourself, to live." She didn't speak, just looked at him and spat in his face, not with contempt, but pity. "You're so pathetic. You need my kneel to feel you exist." Nero laughed, then cried, then screamed, then embraced her, as if clinging to his own shadow. But she didn't embrace back, and so he killed, not with a knife, but with his hands. Slowly, her throat was squeezed until her final moan escaped like a breeze, and when she collapsed, eyes still open, lips still pressed, face still holding that initial smile, Nero held her body, trembling. "Thank you," he whispered. "Finally, someone real." But that was the problem. The real don't stay alive. And from that night, Nero knew what he craved most was what he could never have again: a genuine emotion, a laugh not faked, a refusal not calculated. And those things, now dead in his hands, he returned to the palace, passing beauties still practicing moans, gazes, dreamlike walks, and saw them all as mannequins. No one left worth killing, no one real enough to hate. And so, in the next part, Nero would stop seeking targets. He'd look at himself, try to find, in the emperor's ashes, a small spark of life, a soul that could still feel pain. And if he found none, he'd choose the one he hadn't yet killed, himself. Because when you've killed everything you love, the only thing left to end the addiction is to end yourself. But before Nero could end himself, his mind turned to a name that never truly died in his heart: Poppaea. Not because he still loved her, not quite out of remorse, but because among all who crossed his life, Poppaea was the only one who was both victim and accomplice, the only one he wanted to both embrace and shatter, to save and kill again. Poppaea wasn't an innocent girl tricked into the palace. She was a political artist, a master at making men think they were in control, while they merely ran across the stage she'd set. From their first meeting, Nero was enthralled, not just by her beauty, but by her unshakable confidence, her eyes quietly observing everyone as if she stood outside the world. While other consorts learned to please, Poppia learned to make him hungry. She never initiated, never begged, never moaned on cue, and that's why every soft breath, every fleeting touch, drove Nero mad. He thought he loved her, but really, he was addicted to her indifference, and she knew it better than anyone. Once, in a private play, Poppia acted as a raped slave. When Nero moved to save her, she turned, smiled coldly, and said, "Who needs your saving?" That was the first night he couldn't hold power, and the night he fell into an inescapable trap. He began to fear Poppia, not because she had power, but because she made him feel small. Each silence made him feel abandoned. Each turn away made him invisible, so he did everything to keep her. Gave jewels, built palaces, promised titles, until she was pregnant. That's when it all crumbled. Poppia was no longer the ideal shadow. She began to demand, to complain, to cry from back pain, swollen feet, oversalted food. He couldn't stand reality, couldn't stand a Poppia becoming human, no longer a cold statue, but a body that grumbled, and so, in a fit of rage, he kicked her stomach. One kick, but enough to kill. When she fell, not screaming, not crying, just gasping and clutching her belly, he stood still, then walked away. Didn't save her, didn't call for help, didn't hold her, just walked, as if the obsession was freed. But the truth was, it began again, stronger. From that day he saw her everywhere, in Sporus's face, in a stranger's hand, in a street girl's walk. Poppia, though dead, lived like an unshakable scent, and that's why he married Sporus. That's why he recreated her laugh, her walk, her gaze, her breath, to keep a Poppia who didn't resist, didn't demand, didn't get pregnant, didn't reproach, a perfect Poppia, meaning not real. But the more he tried to hold her, the emptier he felt, because no matter how perfect the copy, it couldn't fill the one feeling he'd had, being challenged by someone real. So was Poppia a victim. Yes, she was killed, robbed of motherhood, turned into memory, but she was also an accomplice, because she sparked in Nero the addiction to rejection. She proved silence could be more powerful than a scream, and she made him realize, love isn't control, it's enduring instability, something he, the control addict, couldn't accept. In the next part, you'll see Nero stop trying to recreate Poppia. He'll try to reconnect with her, through darkness, through ritual, through bodies, or if needed, through his own death. Because love didn't kill her, but death might bring him to her, forever. But before Nero crossed the line between life and death, he did one final thing, something he hadn't dared face in years. Look at the female body through his own eyes, not as a possessor, not as a spectator, but as a failure. A man who tried to turn every female body into a stage, yet couldn't grasp its true nature. To Nero, a woman's body was always a strange cipher, both desirable and detestable, sacred and filthy. He loved the curves, but scorned menstruation. He adored the smile, but hated tears. He worshipped softness, but when that softness turned to protest or demands, he raged. A woman's body to him had to be a living display, beautiful, but silent, smiling, but thoughtless, moaning, but not craving climax. It had to be ready, but not wanting. It had to know pain, but not resist. So every woman in his life was broken into functional parts. Face to admire, mouth to moan, breasts to touch, hips to position, vagina to dominate, but none could be whole, none could have an intact soul. He loved the parts, but couldn't bear their complete presence. Even with Poppia, who drove him wild when she started becoming human with morning sickness, changing body odor, odd irritability, he felt betrayed, as if her body had turned traitor. In Nero's performances, women were always placed on pedestals like goddesses, but only to strip, to slow their movements, steps, moans, as if dissecting emotions under a microscope. Some nights, he made 5 girls stand motionless in a room for 2 hours, each with a golden leaf stuck to their chest, just to see who held absolute silence longest. If the leaf fell, it meant they wanted too much, and those who wanted were discarded. Nero didn't like women with desire. He only wanted reactions, like a harp, a flute, a drum. They had to sound on rhythm, on pitch, and when they stopped sounding, they were thrown away. But the irony was, because he stripped them of desire, none ever truly wanted him. It was all pretense. And that, late in life, hit back like a blow to his pride. One night, Nero sat in a cold bathhouse, surrounded by 3 naked female corpses covered in flowers. He told servants to burn incense, sprinkle gold dust on their hair, and began talking as if they were alive. He asked, "If I weren't emperor, would you still spread your legs for me?" No one answered, obviously, but that question kept repeating. Every night, in his head, he began doubting everything. Had anyone ever truly wanted him, or just what he offered? He'd raped, but now, for the first time, he felt utterly rejected by silence. The female body, he realized, wasn't a door. It was a mirror. When he held them, he saw only himself. When he hurt them, he heard his own mind's screams. When they climaxed, real or fake, he was just trying to reclaim the life slipping from his body, hourly. And now, with no feeling, no need, no thrill, he saw them clearer than ever. Saw eyes that once looked at him like a god, now empty. Saw hands that once trembled for him, now cold. Saw bodies once possessed, now silent as stone. He knew he'd failed. He couldn't truly touch anyone. Not with hands, not with power, not with his penis, not with any ritual. Because to touch another, one condition must come first. You must exist as a human. And he, for so long, existed only as a mirage of power, a talking addiction, a hunger dressed in imperial robes. In the next part, you'll see Nero seek what he never had, a real, living, pained, hating woman, not to possess anymore, but to ask, "If I were no longer emperor, would you forgive me?" A question with no guaranteed answer, but it was all he had left to hold him from the final edge, because for the first time, he didn't seek pleasure, he sought forgiveness. And so Nero returned to where all sins began, the Domus Aurea, his golden palace, the vast jeweled cave, lined with mirrors, steeped in perfume, the great womb from which he was born, and where he began devouring himself. That night, there was no feast, no music, no slaves, not a soul, just him, in a thin robe, barefoot on cold marble. Each step echoed through 100 domes, like a ghastly requiem. The Domus Aurea was no longer radiant. Frescoes blurred, golden doors rusted, garden trees bore no flowers, and in his heart, the same. The long night began in the room where he'd killed Poppaea, where he'd once said, "You ruined my performance." Now, no one was there, just an empty bronze basin, an old bloodstain on the wall, and a candle burning backward. He sat on the floor, knees clutched, staring at the icy wall, mumbling, "If you were alive, would you say anything?" Then he laughed, because he knew Poppaea would say nothing. That was her power. That night, Nero walked through each room like crossing his life. The poetry performance hall, where he'd recited lustful verses amid flutes and cries, now silent as a tomb. The roll swap room, where slaves sat in chairs, nobles served wine, and he'd been whipped to taste humanity. Now props rusted, ropes rotted, beds dust-covered. Then the mirror room, where he'd made bodies reflect eternally. He gazed into a broken mirror, his face unclear, just a smudge amid dried blood and darkness. "Who am I?" he asked. No answer. And then he entered the final room, a room he'd barred for 3 years, the memory chamber, where he kept relics of those who died for him. His mother's bracelet, a blood-soaked cloth from Poppaea, Sporus's mask, a letter from the nameless boy, forced to perform lifelong, a braided hair necklace, a shard of a shattered bust, and in the room's center, a stone bed. On it, Nero lay, left hand on chest, right hand clutching a tiny bust of himself, carved when he first took the throne. The long night began to breathe. In unwitnessed silence, he recited names: Poppaea, Agrippina, Sporus, Leontius, the girl who spat at me, the silent woman, the girl who smiled through pain, the one who didn't climax despite my efforts, the last one who didn't touch me, though I wept. Each name was a slow knife. No one stabbed. He stabbed himself. No one judged. He judged himself. No one accused. He confessed. His eyes welled, not from regret, but from exhaustion, exhausted to the soul, too tired to touch anyone, to see anyone, to be desired. That night, the Domus Aurea was no palace. It was a tomb, the tomb of all who lived wrong in the play of an emperor, who never knew when to stop, and he was the final, unburied corpse. In the haze between real, fake, dream, and madness, he whispered, "If anyone hears me, Please forgive. Not because I deserve it, but because I have nothing left to hold. In the next part, you'll see the first dawn after that night, but not a dawn of light, a dawn of collapse. So when Rome began cracking under the feet of those who built it, when the empire exhaled its final breath, and no one bothered to clap, and when the name Nero began being erased from every mouth, as if he never existed. Because sometimes, the worst punishment isn't condemnation, it's being forgotten. But before Nero's name was fully erased from every mouth, before Rome mustered the courage to wipe the mad emperor from collective memory, one thing remains to be told, a truth not in bedrooms, not screamed in orgies, not etched on the flesh of the raped, but outside, in the cold stone walls, where the empire's soul once stood, the law, the supposed foundation, meant to stand firm against all passions. But in Nero's time, even the law knelt not in defeat, but seduced, bribed, torn line by hands sticky with honey and blood. When the emperor's desire ceased to be personal and became a principle of rule, every law became a prop for the game. Laws were rewritten by emotion, and Nero's emotions were as fickle as the Domus Aurea's lights. Now blood red, now sickly yellow, now pale green, now snuffed out. Once, a boy accused of resisting the emperor's favor, refusing Nero's bed, was brought before a council. No formal charge, no evidence, no witnesses, just a record of Nero's disappointed voice. He ruined my mood. And so, exile. The Senate stayed silent, because no one wanted to be the next to ruin his mood. In another case, a noble woman sued her lover for rape, but since he was a high-ranking official in the emperor's inner circle, her testimony was deemed disruptive to royal joy. She was convicted of slander, whipped 40 times, stripped of her right to sue forever. No one objected, because by then, everyone knew the law wasn't judgment, it was performance. Starting with tears, ending with the emperor's laughter. A lawyer once filed a suit for a female slave gang-raped in the imperial residence. The suit wasn't read, but the lawyer was summoned to a feast, forced to strip, hung upside down from the ceiling, and for 3 hours had grease smeared on his chest while hearing Nero's love poem to Poppaea repeated. No one asked why, because humiliation was the new administrative process. Not beheading, not imprisonment, but shredding dignity before the public. Some criminals were acquitted, just for crying at the right moment under Nero's gaze. Some innocents were convicted, for eyes lacking reverence when Nero entered. Some death sentences were issued not for crimes, but for the accused not being alluring. And if you think only commoners faced this, you're wrong. The political elite, too, became supporting actors in Nero's endless drama of desire. A veteran judge, serving under 3 reigns, was sacked for not knowing how to comment on a girl's striptease at a palace feast. Asked, "What do you think of her waist?" He replied, "I only saw her eyes." That was his mistake. Because in Nero's Rome, anyone who looked at a woman's eyes instead of her body was a hypocrite. And hypocrisy was the gravest crime. Because Nero hated most those who tried to seem above him, so the judge was expelled from the Senate, shaved, sent to a barren island. Official reason: failure to appreciate the empire's freedom. Desire rewrote the constitution. The law became a matter of taste, valid or not by the emperor's whim, not right or wrong. Every decree came with moans or laughter. Every trial ended with a vague nod. Rome was no longer an empire of law. It was a tragic comedy, where even gods had to strip to be heard. In the next part, you'll see the cost of turning the law into a joke, when those who bowed to survive began to look up, not from sudden courage, but because they had nothing left to lose. When moans no longer scared, when blood grew boring, when the Domus Aurea lost its shine, only one fate awaited the man who made the law kneel to be crushed by history and never rise again. But before history swung its hammer, before Rome roared to reclaim its conscience, there was a group quietly watching it all, not with power, not with sex, but with thought. The philosophers, the priests, those who lived not by flesh, but by faith and reflection. And strangely, these people, who claimed detachment from worldly desires, became both loyal spectators and peculiar playthings in Nero's descent into depravity. Because Nero, addicted to every limit, couldn't tolerate anyone existing outside his web of lust. He rejected purity. He rejected anyone standing beyond the control of pleasure, so he sought them out. Not to hear sermons, but to ask, "Do you tremble when you touch flesh?" For Stoic philosophers like Seneca, his former teacher, the question wasn't an insult, it was a challenge. And Seneca, old, weary, silent, replied, "Trembling is instinct. Not acting on it is reason." That made Nero pause, then laugh, then declare, "Good, then I'll test your reason." Thus began a series of bizarre games. Nero summoned philosophers, priests, and sages to the palace, not to discuss philosophy, but to face situations no one taught them to handle. A 16-year-old girl, naked, crying in the room, asking, "If a priest won't save me, who will?" A bound gay youth saying, "If a philosopher won't kiss me, it's hypocrisy." A group of slaves performing a collective orgy, then turning to ask, "What does reason say about need?" It was no longer a test of morality, it was mental torture, a way for Nero to find new pleasure, shaking those seen as moral foundations. Some priests crumbled, some philosophers fell silent, some killed themselves after being forced to prove their beliefs with their bodies. Others joined the game, citing theories to justify passion. One philosopher, who wrote about the soul's freedom, slept with Nero, then penned a new treatise, "Touch the Flesh to Transcend It." He was dubbed an enlightener, but everyone knew he'd betrayed the spirit. A priest was caught using rosary beads to bind a boy in the harem. A philosopher was found recording women's moans to study ancient emotions. Nero clapped, laughed, "You're just me," in robes, and that reassured him. No one was better than him, they just hadn't been put in the right place. Once Nero held a philosophical trial, where 3 sages faced 3 prostitutes, tasked with convincing them to quit their trade. Failure meant spending a night as a client. Result, all 3 failed. One lost his mind, fleeing at midnight. One stayed, and never left the domus aurea. One vanished. Rumors said he died trying to touch a girl's soul with his hands. Nero called it a ritual to erase boundaries, but the truth was, he just wanted to prove no one could escape him. No one was pure enough to stand outside his world, and if they were, he'd drag them in, twisting their philosophy, branding it with sex like a permanent mark. Because for Nero, the cruelest act wasn't raping a body, it was raping a belief. And when you break the faith of someone who lives by conviction, you've killed them entirely. In the next part, you'll see the price paid by those who stayed silent. When Rome began to stir, not from physical wounds, but from having nothing left to believe in. When priests stopped preaching and sold prayers. When philosophers stopped writing books and copied pleasure diaries. When souls shattered, not from sex, but from losing direction. That's what truly set Rome ablaze, not with fire, but with a permanent fracture in the moral spine of a civilization. But don't think Rome fell into crisis solely because of Nero. If an empire could be incinerated by one tyrant, its foundations were never solid. In truth, desire and death had always lain side by side in Rome's heart from the start. Under Nero, they were just dragged into the light, displayed, worshipped as new gods. In Roman culture, sex wasn't just personal pleasure, but a symbol of power, life, victory, and destruction. Ancient Romans didn't separate sex from death. They saw both as ends of the same river. One side creation, the other conclusion, the current between them, pleasure. In noble tombs, it wasn't rare to find erotic carvings beside philosophical inscriptions. A painting of a naked woman riding her dead lover, paired with, "You left my life only to live forever in the desire I carry." That wasn't crude, it was religion. In Roman thought, the more intense the physical pleasure, the closer to death. A moan at climax was no different from the cry of a soul leaving the body. And so, death became desirable, if it tasted of sex. Nero didn't invent this. He inherited it and amplified it. In his reign, sexual rituals tied to funerals, body-blending ceremonies were held by graves, where the living coupled with statues or fresh corpses, believing it kept souls from leaving the world alone. There were rituals called virgin blood offerings, where virgins were taken to cemeteries, deflowered by a near-dead survivor, a way to carry life across death's threshold. Some believed touching a corpse after climax preserved youth, so couples hired bodies as springboards for youth. Poets of the time wrote of erotic sorrow, where death wasn't tragedy, but the final climax. the body burning to its last cell, then vanishing like a moan's last breath. Nero loved this idea. He'd summon handsome condemned prisoners, bathe them, dress them in silk, anoint them with perfume, then sleep with them before their execution. He said, if death comes to them like lovemaking, I'm the final grace they carry. He even tried a ritual of offering death to pleasure, tying a man to a chair, having 3 virgins couple with him in turn, then Nero himself stabbing the man's heart at the peak of his cry. Some said he didn't kill from hate, but to frame the perfect moment. Even outside the court, commoners weren't much different. Brothels in Nero's time had ascension rooms, where clients paid extra to couple on stone beds between 2 urns of ashes. The smell of corpses, sweat, and semen blended into an obsessive ritual. Some said after sex there, they dreamed of dying, and waking they laughed. I saw my soul smile in satisfaction. It wasn't strange that Rome called climax the little death, and Nero, pushing every ritual to the extreme, turned the little death into real death. The problem was, when sex and death became one, there was no line between life and destruction. No one knew if they were loving or killing, if a moan was pleasure or despair, if an embrace was cherishing or pushing someone into fire. That was Rome at its end, a city moaning, but no one knew why, an empire reaching a grand climax, then collapsing. In the next part, you'll see what happens when those moans no longer thrilled, when death became repetitive and dull, when Rome, in its prolonged lustful trance, forgot how to live, and only sought to die more beautifully. And Nero? He stood amid those moans, no longer the conductor, but swallowed by the symphony of pleasure he'd composed. And like any heavy addict, when the usual drug lost effect, he sought something stronger, higher, more illusory, a final dose, to revive the dead, feeling within. Now, Nero no longer craved humans. He was tired of mortal flesh, sick of its smell, predictable moans, reflexes, devoted gazes. He needed something untouchable, inexplicable, unresisting, yet still thrilling. So imagination took the throne. He began making love to gods, not figuratively, literally. He built a private shrine in the Domus Aurea, solely for divine lust rituals. Each night, a god was summoned through statues, offerings, or costumed actors. One night, Aphrodite, goddess of love, played by a naked girl in a gold mask, speaking only in poetry, anointed with pearl oil for 3 hours before entering. Another night, Apollo, god of light, portrayed by a slender slave with glass blue eyes, allowed only to glance at Nero sideways, never directly. Sometimes Bacchus, god of wine, with 2 actors, man and woman, drunk and crazed, laughing and crying, rolling on the stone floor. Nero didn't care who they were. He just needed to feel he was coupling with the supernatural, and strangely, it worked. At least at first. For a brief time, he felt he'd risen from the depths, that he was touching what no one dared, that he was special, sanctified with each thrust. But like any addiction, the illusion soon shattered. Even gods started blending together. When all were just masked humans, you soon realized it was still the same hands, hips, moans, just a different name. So Nero went further. He declared himself a god, no longer coupling with gods, but letting gods couple with him. He ordered a giant Zeus statue with a hollow belly, big enough for a person to climb inside, moving arms and mouth with pulleys. During sex, he lay beneath, arms raised, as if embraced by Zeus from the heavens. Once, he demanded the palace stay silent all night, just to hear the gods whisper. At climax, no one dared object. Who dares interrupt a god? These Olympian unions became secretive but powerful rituals. Those chosen as gods that day earned coin, privilege, and a few more months of life. But a poor performance, dampening Nero's mood, meant elimination by morning. One man had his tongue cut for moaning off rhythm, as Hermes. A girl died for crying real tears, as Persephone. Instead of showing mythic pain in silence, everything was a stage, but no one knew who the audience was. Once, Nero played Ganymede, the fairest youth taken to the heavens by Zeus, with a tall man, in golden armor, as the thunder god. The divine coupling happened in the palace courtyard, under an open roof. That night, Nero fainted. But waking, he whispered, "For the first time, I felt my soul leave my body." The problem was, he couldn't return. Once raised to a god's lover, reality grew hateful. He began to loathe real bodies, couldn't stand sweat, arrhythmic breaths, freckled skin. He demanded partners be more poetic, cleaner, less human. And when no one could meet that, he began coupling with illusions, lying alone, moaning alone, touching air, calling God's names, then crying. "No one's divine enough to hurt me," he said. "No one's alive enough to thrill me." In the next part, you'll see Nero reach the final edge of delusion, marrying a god, not a human playing a god, but himself as a god. A bizarre wedding where groom, bride, priest and deity were one person, and Rome then could only stand outside, watching an emperor dissolve into his own fantasy, like a dying star no one could extinguish. But for Nero, the trance wasn't random chaos. It had order, structure, cycles, because even in madness he was emperor, and an emperor must manage. So, Nero had something no king before or after dared possess: a sex schedule, a handwritten record, 6 scrolls long detailing dates, times, partners, roles, themes, immersion levels, and pleasure outcomes of each encounter. The scribe was none other than the palace secretary, a male slave with a prodigious memory, forbidden to love, touch, or moan for anyone. Each morning, he presented the schedule to Nero like state affairs. Today, 14th of Sextilis, 7 a.m., third reenactment of Venus's killing in the spring. Noon, silent coupling with 2 blind slaves. 9 p.m., 16th ceremony, bonding emperor, and Poppy's statue. Each event had preparations, scents, lighting, props, training for supporting actors, psychological warm-ups. Nero didn't dive into flesh instinctively. He treated sex like art. It needed a theme, climax, turning point, and post-event review. There was a scoring system for each person, emotional notes. Partner moaned too early, needs more training. Blood scene, not real enough. Consider real dagger next time. Scent too similar to Poppy's death night, feels repetitive. In that schedule, Nero categorized his desires into emotional cycles. 3 creative days a week, new scripts. 2 traditional days, Roman-style sex, no props. 1 self-punishment day, playing slave, bound, humiliated. And 1 divine day, reserved for sex with imagined gods. Each month had a 9th day of destruction, all rules broken. He allowed reverse rape, death rolls, coupling amid chants and howls. 1 entry read, 9th day, Poppy reborn as a man, ends in blood and tears shattered in the mirror. The reader couldn't show emotion. The scribe couldn't comment. But Rome whispered of the scroll as a perverse relic. Those named in it are blessed or cursed. And because of the schedule, Nero controlled his depravity, not letting it swallow him unexpectedly, but riding it like a knight on a mad beast. He once bragged to a senator, "While you kiss in secret, to couple by plan, Disporus, sex is only worth it when composed like music." But the irony was, the more meticulously he planned, the more rhythmic, the more perfect it became, the emptier it felt. The schedule grew longer, notes more detailed, but reality grew repetitive. Same moans, same bodies, roles no longer surprising, climaxes predictable. Once, Nero flipped through the schedule and said, "I know exactly where every drop of sweat will fall, and that makes me want to die." Yet he continued, because without the schedule, he'd face something worse: emptiness. A day without a sex script, for Nero, was a day without reason to exist. That's why he kept the schedule, until the end, a shield between him and total collapse. In the next part, you'll see what happens when the schedule falters, when a routine coupling doesn't follow the script, when someone dares defy it, not play the role, not moan on cue, not bow. And Nero, who killed for love, spared for hate, moaned for power, will face what he didn't foresee: a real body, free, not bound by the schedule. And that moment will tear apart the structure he so carefully built, like the first crack in a golden palace, lined with desire. And from that crack, something leaked, not loud, not fiery, but smoldering and persistent: meaninglessness. Specifically, gender began to melt, not because Nero wanted to break boundaries, but because he no longer saw any boundary as valuable. Male or female, masculine or feminine, active or passive, mortal or divine, all became fluid, interchangeable, dissolving into each other like wax in cold incense nights. A body was no longer a declaration, but a mask, to wear, remove, distort, invert, paint. Nero, once proud of his imperial manhood, began demanding female pronouns in performances. He called himself Rome's wife, mother of the people, virgin offered. Once, he appeared before the public in a pure white gown, hair braided, eyes lined black, lips painted blood red, walking like a bride about to wed herself. In the palace, gender swap rituals became routine. No one asked, "What are you?" but "Who do you want to be today?" Men once in armor, now wore sheer silk, heavily made up, practicing goddess-like grace. Young girls were equipped with whips, armor, strap-ons, mounting partners with empty eyes. To Nero, gender wasn't identity, it was a stage prop. One could be Sporus yesterday, Poppia today, a war god tomorrow, or even Nero, if skilled enough. Because what scared him most wasn't men or women, but someone who didn't follow the script. Gender lost meaning, not just in flesh, but in emotion. Who dominates, who submits, who loves, who pretends, who hurts truly, who moans for the role, all blended into an inescapable masquerade. One night, Nero held a ceremony called the Faceless Night. Everyone wore masks, identical robes, no speaking. They connected only through touch, scent, skin's dampness. Then all coupled with the nearest person, not knowing who, what gender, or if they consented. Afterward, no one could ask who was who. Nero said, that's the only way to touch the true essence. But that essence, if it existed, was crushed right after. Because when no one could be themselves, all became dolls, moaning mannequins, bodies needing no questions, no gender, no identity. And strangely, that's when Nero began losing pleasure. Not because he tired of sex, but because sex no longer reflected him. When you look into someone's eyes and don't know who they are, you don't know who you are. And in Rome, where all wore masks, where gender was no longer the key to emotions, Nero realized he had no emotions left. He didn't know who to desire, who to control, who to moan for. All were him, and at the same time, none were him. The greatest irony was, when all gender was erased, power had nowhere to rest. You can't dominate someone with no name, no gender, no role. You can't force a body to bow if it doesn't know what it is. The more Nero tried to stay emperor, the more he became a clown painted with myth, dressed in a wedding gown of power, paraded among those who no longer knew their own kind. In the next part, you'll see how Nero reacts when his own body refuses to play the role, when his penis no longer rises, his voice no longer commands, his mirrored eyes no longer recognize himself. All that's left is a lump of flesh that remembers, and memory, not lust, will be the final torturer of Nero, with a pain that can't be moaned away, can't be resisted, can't be escaped with sex. That's when Rome ceases to be an empire's capital and becomes the final stage of a failed body, a body once glorified as divine, adorned like a work of art, worshipped as a source of life, now merely a vessel for a rotting mind. And in that moment, pleasure was no longer the goal. It became the final escape route, escaping memory, escaping the mirror, escaping the moaning voices of dead bodies in his head. Nero no longer made love for pleasure, he did it to forget, to erase, to drown the screams in his dreams with moans in reality. But the more he moaned, the clearer he heard the silence, the deeper he thrust into flesh, the more he stabbed into emptiness. One night, he demanded 30 breathing corpses. That's what he called the slaves chosen, not for beauty or skill, but for their emptiness. No reactions, no emotions, no memories, just shells with heartbeats. He spread them across the room, one by one, saying nothing, naming no one, not making love in the classic sense, but touching each like flipping an off switch, once, twice. By the 18th, he stopped. He couldn't get hard anymore. He wasn't breathing heavily. He just sat down, amid the wet, motionless bodies, and muttered, "Why are you alive when no one remembers me?" Other times, he sought pain to awaken dead pleasure. He demanded to be whipped, cursed, spat on. He told Sporus, "Call me trash, a talking corpse, a black hole on the throne." But even humiliated, dragged, bleeding, he felt nothing. Sometimes he tried drugs, wine, ancient Egyptian rituals, mixing mummy water with resin to drink. But the result was the same: silence. A thick, damp silence, like mud clinging to his lungs. And that's when he invented the escape room. A sealed chamber, no exits, just a slot for food and a high air vent. Inside, only pillows, blankets, wine, and a mirror. He entered alone, naked, bringing no one, and stayed 3 days, 3 nights. No light, no voices, no actors, no roles, just him and himself. The first time, he nearly went mad. He moaned, touched himself, called out to gods, his mother, Poppia, Sporus, but no one answered. He smashed his head into the mirror, then cried, then slept, then dreamed of a boy standing at the door, silently watching, then turning away. The second time, he just sat and smelled his body decaying, suppressed sweat, urine, blood, wine fermenting in his throat. The third time, he did nothing, just lay there, no eating, no drinking, no touching, as if waiting to die. When the guards opened the door after 3 days, they found him alive, but with eyes so empty, no one dared ask anything. He only said one thing after, "No one's chasing me, but I still have to run." Escaping himself, in the end, was the fiercest flight, and sex, once his weapon, throne, and language of power, now was just a thin cloth over a gaping crack in his mind. Nero used pleasure to flee the truth that he had no one left to desire, no one desiring him, and worst of all, no one believing he truly existed as a human. In the next part, you'll see when escape stops working, when every exit leads to one place: memories of the first nights, of Poppia alive, of his mother, not yet killed, of himself, when he still knew who he was. But returning to memory is also facing it. And not everyone survives staring into that final mirror, where the past appears like a spectre, demanding everything back. The past, no longer a place for regret, but a dagger slowly piercing the skin. And Nero, after escaping through pleasure, divine illusions, heretical rituals, or nameless bodies, was finally trapped by what he tried to bury his whole life: his own decay, not his soul, but his body. The body of an emperor once sculpted, praised, showered with flowers, now it betrayed him piece by piece, like a miniature Rome crumbling silently. The signs came gradually. His penis stopped responding. His body odor changed. His breath always smelled of rusted iron. His tongue bled after drunken nights. His knees buckled during role plays. And his eyes, once a weapon of seduction, now clouded red like spoiled milk. Nero refused doctors. He said, "Who can cure a melting god?" But Rome no longer saw him as divine. They whispered of blemishes spreading from his chest, of moans hoarse like a drowning man's throat, of an emperor now only coupling in darkness, hiding his body from sight. In that darkness, he whispered to partners, "Touch me as if I never existed." But he had to look again, not with eyes, but with pain. He began seeking his busts around the palace, each depicting a phase of his life. Young Nero, slender, clear-eyed, crowned Nero, square jaw, broad chest, hand raised high. Poppia's Nero, softer, lips curved, almost smiling. The latest, sagging cheeks, thick neck, drooping chest, bloated belly like poisoning. He lined them up, sat staring at each, like examining archaeological layers of his own desire. Layer 1, craving to touch someone, to know he existed. Layer 2, yearning to master others' bodies, to forget his smallness. Layer 3, obsession with being deified through moans. Layer 4, hating all who were real, because they reminded him he wasn't enough to be loved. Layer 5, no more desire, only rituals. Layer 6, escape. Layer 7, despair, at no longer escaping. And the final layer, he called it, the vacuum of desire. A place where you want nothing, but can't live without wanting. And the body, once a machine of craving, now inert as stone. He couldn't sleep, couldn't stand long, couldn't sing, couldn't cry, couldn't laugh. He just lay, each night a different bed, each room a different smell, to fool himself into thinking he was changing. But every smell led to one thing: rot. Rot of organs, rot of a dissolving tongue, rot of the human in emperor, melting away. Sporus no longer slept with him. Slaves avoided his eyes. Generals grew scarce. His body odor, tainted feasts. Only one remained, the sex schedule scribe, still silent, still delivering the schedule each morning, still not abandoning. And one day he told Nero, "You have no more sessions to schedule." Nero asked, "Why?" He replied, "Your body no longer takes signals." That's how the sex schedule ended, not with death, but with biology surrendering. And Nero, who thought himself the fertility god of an empire, now lay in bed, unable to move, commanding only with eyes. But no one needed commands, because Rome was preparing to cut ties with him. In the next part, you'll see Nero face the one thing he couldn't control: time. No desire left, no body, no roles, just breaths, repeating, weakening, and no one remembering when they stopped. An emperor who lived by sex, and would die in silence, where no one desired him, no one moaned for him, no one remembered he once had a body. But Nero still remembered, and that was the final tragedy. Memory didn't fade with the body. It lingered relentless, screaming in his head when all else went quiet. Like Rome, trying to sleep, to forget a decade-long frenzy, to mend its torn moral fabric, to find laughter without moans mixed in. But in that moment, Nero still demanded to sing. He lay there, ravaged, skin wrinkled like half-burned paper, voice rasping like stones grinding, whispering to the last slave willing to approach, "Bring my lyre, I haven't finished singing." No one answered. The lyre had been buried since his final performance became a Senate joke, but Nero thought it was there. In his mind, all of Rome sat in the stands, waiting for his farewell song. "Some nights," he shouted, "you don't understand, I'm an artist. I was born to perform, not die silently like a crippled old man." Then he propped himself up, head raised, gasping like pulling notes from his chest, and he sang. No one heard, just moldy walls, unlit candles, faceless busts, and he, with a voice choked like wind trapped in an ash urn, sang as if the world bowed in silence. Each day, a different piece, sometimes a hymn to Mars, sometimes a dirge Poppia loved. Some days he composed cold night, wide bed, distant bodies. My skin itches like unplanted earth. Who recalls my eyes wet with pleasure? Who moans when I moan? No one answered, but he sang, because it was all he had left. No sex, no power, no intact body. Music was the last illusion he could control, and that illusion exhausted Rome. Those who once feared him now wanted silence, not from hate, but shame. They didn't want to remember an emperor who made an empire moan to his rhythm. He now singing, alone like an abandoned child. The Senate stopped sending gifts, soldiers stopped guarding, citizens avoided the path to the Domus Aurea like a haunted ruin. And Nero, he kept singing, until his voice broke completely, not from death, but from a throat without breath. He opened his mouth, no sound, hands groped the air for melody, and that's when the last slave touched his shoulder, whispering, "Rome is asleep, sir. You can stop." But Nero didn't. He shook his head. A tear fell, not from pain, but regret. Regret that this final role had no audience, and he, like all stage addicts, didn't fear death, only no one watching. In the next part, you'll see the curtain fall, when the last song dies, when the empire closes its darkest chapter, when an emperor's body is buried hastily. No rituals, no tears, but history. A late spectator will return and flip each page to ask what turned a fragile boy into a lustful tyrant. And is it true that, at desire's core, lies only a song in an empty room, with no one rising to clap? Perhaps so, because no one killed Nero, no blade stabbed him, no poison laced his wine, no palace plot. His death came slowly, quietly, from tiny cracks in his mind, and from what he once worshipped, lived for, turned Rome into an altar, to shower with flowers. Sex didn't kill him. It just took him apart, piece by piece, until nothing human remained. At first, sex was power, a way for a frail boy to prove he could make others tremble with a glance. Then it became a stage, where he was director, writer, actor, audience. Then a weapon, to control, punish, kill, without a knife. Finally, an illusion, something he chased, to remember he existed. Each coupling, Nero didn't seek pleasure. He sought proof of life, as if without someone moaning beneath him, he was already dead. And so, when no one moaned, when his body wouldn't rise, when Rome stopped saying his name, what died wasn't Nero. It was the last shred of human in him. Physical death was just the final seal. The destruction began long ago, from the moment he saw his mother's blood splash his gown, from Poppæa's moan not of pleasure, but fear, from the first time he looked in the mirror and saw not eyes, but a role. Sex didn't kill him. It made him forget who he was, made him think touching others was the right to redefine himself, made him believe if he fucked enough, he'd know what he wanted. But each climax only left him emptier, like digging deeper and finding no bottom. In the end, he was just a wrinkled body, a fractured memory, a pile of faceless busts, and a sex schedule with no scribe. And Rome lived on, without him. As if it all was a collective nightmare, everyone remembered, but no one spoke of. They smashed his statues, burned books, rewrote history, struck his name from the list of true emperors, but no one truly erased him, because he wasn't in records. He was in the shadows of every suppressed desire, in every sidelong glance, in every quickened breath behind closed doors, in every strange dream where the strong are called God and the weak moan to the script. Nero's story isn't just about a mad emperor, it's about how a society can nurture a craving until no one dares ask, what are we doing? Sex didn't kill Nero, but it opened the door for everything else. Violence, control, illusion, loneliness, and finally, absolute emptiness. By then, Nero wasn't a man, he was a symbol, the final result of a civilization letting pleasure lead without asking, where to? And now, with Rome asleep, its walls fallen to build anew, with posterity recalling him only by a twisted name, perhaps the fairest thing history can do is look at him not with contempt, but fear, because in each of us lives a small Nero, and the question isn't, why did he become this? But if power, pleasure, and emptiness come at once, would I be different? Nero's story isn't just a historical tragedy, but a warped mirror, reflecting a very real danger in modern American society, the worship of personal pleasure and absolute power without moral boundaries. Nero didn't start as a monster, he was human, full of wounds, craving recognition, uncertain of himself. But when he had everything, political power, boundless sex, the ability to redefine reality, the first thing he lost was his identity. This is a clear warning in an age where social media, technology, fame, and extreme individualism create new Neros daily. In America, personalizing values, championing free expression, gender freedom, and creativity is vital. But when there's no line between real emotion and performance, between pleasure and morality, between freedom and manipulating others, we risk becoming victims of an illusion. Nero sang as Rome fell silent. Like many today, sing, posting, speaking, performing, while inside is an untouched void. Ask yourself, is what I chase real, or just a role I can't escape? The lesson is, power, sex, and expressive freedom, without moral grounding or self-understanding, may not kill you instantly, but they'll make you lose what can't be regained, humanity. If Nero's story makes you rethink power, pleasure, and emptiness in today's world, hit subscribe to catch more raw, painful historical slices like this. Thanks for sticking to the end, and see you in the next historical journey, where humanity always mirrors the starkest truths.